We are going to talk about the menstrual cycle, and it is important for us midwives to understand what the menstrual cycle is so that we know how to prevent pregnancy and we know how to give our health education to these women who come across our medical facilities seeking for help that they may want in order for them to maintain this process of family planning. And uh, the first thing that we want to talk about is the stages of the menstrual cycle. Now, the stages of the menstrual cycle depends on which books you are reading. There are books which says that the menstrual cycle is in 3 stages, and other books will go on to say that the menstrual cycle is in 4 stages, and others can even go on to say that the menstrual cycle is only in 2 stages. So, depending on the books that you are reading, the menstrual cycle's phases might differ. But in this talk, specifically, we are going to talk about the 4 stages of the menstrual cycle. And one thing to put in mind, regardless of the stages, the only thing that we should keep in mind is the hormones that regulates the menstrual cycle. And where does this journey start from? Probably you know we have the hypothalamus just underneath the brain. And below the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is divided into 2 lobes. There is the posterior lobe and the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So this bit here will be the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary, and this bit here is the posterior pituitary gland. We'll name it the PP, the posterior pituitary gland. And what happens is that during puberty, the hypothalamus starts secreting a hormone called the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And this hormone is secreted by the hypothalamus. And this hormone does is that it will go directly via the portal system from the hypothalamus, and then it will go to the anterior pituitary gland, and then from there it will stimulate the cells of the anterior pituitary gland, and these cells are called the gonadotropin. The gonadotropin hormones. The gonadotropin. And what this does is they will be secreted, they will be pressured to start secreting what we call the follicle stimulating hormone, and the luteinizing hormone, the LH. And these are the hormones that regulate the menstrual cycle that we are about to talk about. And to begin with, we are going to talk about the first stage of the menstrual cycle. So the first stage of the menstrual cycle is what we term as the menstruation. The menstruation. Now, menstruation is the time during which you see women see their blood coming out through the vagina. This is the first day of the menstrual cycle, basically, in all women. So, if, for example, if someone has got the menstrual cycle, which is 28 days, then their ovulation period is likely to be on the day of 14, because ovulation takes place around about the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. That is about if the woman's menstrual cycle is regular. So the first period is the menstrual cycle, the menstruation, and this is the just to put it in simple terms clearly, this is what we call the period. This is the discharge of the blood together with some uterine contents which were not fertilized, which are not needed by the uterus via the vagina. And it is the first day of the menstrual cycle. And the reason why this happens is because from the previous menstrual cycle, there is what we call the corpus luteum. And if the corpus luteum was not fertilized, then the corpus luteum will develop into the non-functional structure called the corpus albicans, and the corpus albicans does not produce anything. So for example, the corpus albicans can't produce estrogen, and estrogen is important to maintain the endometrium and to secrete some nutrients which are needed for the baby. But because the corpus luteum was not fertilized, so it will go on to be called the corpus albicans, the non-functional layer, and the non-functional layer can't produce estrogen, and the estrogen was needed to maintain the endometrium, so we end up having this onset of the next menstrual cycle. That's what it's all about. The second stage is the follicular stage or the follicular phase. Now, as the name suggests, the follicular phase is only dealing with one type of hormone, and that hormone which is regulating the follicular phase is the follicle stimulating hormone. That's the reason why it's called the follicular phase. Now, to begin with, we are going to go direct into the ovaries so that we get an understanding of how this is happening. So we have the first stage as the menstruation phase, the first day during which the menses happens, and we are on the follicular phase, which is the second phase of the menstrual cycle. And this suggests, as the name suggests, we are dealing with the follicle stimulating hormone. And what happens is that during puberty, at around about 12 to 15 years, girls start producing the hormone called the follicle stimulating hormone. And before they start producing this type of hormone, all the girls are born with 10,000 and thousands of these cells. They call the primordial cells, the follicles. They are born with the follicles. So for example, we imagine this is a follicle. So this is a follicle. This is the follicle. Women are, sorry, not women, but the girls are born with thousands of these. But as they are growing up, inside of these follicles, there is what we call a potential ovum or oocyte, and that is what we need for fertilization to take place. So there's going to be an ovum in here. So there's an ovum inside, and these cells, they are singular simple cells, and these are the granulosa cells. But they don't do anything, they don't do a great deal. And at puberty, the females start producing an hormone called the follicle stimulating hormone, influenced by the gonadotropin releasing hormone of the hypothalamus. And that hormone will act on these cells, and then it will make them to develop into some certain types of cells called the primary cells, and then they will also go on to develop into the secondary cells, and then at the later stage they will also develop into what we call the Graafian mature follicles. So I know it's hard sometimes to follow, but we are going to make a diagram so that we can have a better understanding of what we are talking about. So due to the influence of the follicle stimulating hormone acts on these cells, and then it will cause cell divisions in these cells, and then they will develop into what we call the primary cells, still with an ovum inside, and then they will develop into secondary cells also. Still these cells, still the ovum inside, and then they will also develop into what we call the Glefian mature follicle. So these are the cells, the follicles of the females and women's and the girls. When they are born, they don't have anything. They don't have an hormone to stimulate them to go into a mature Glefian follicle, which is getting ready to be fertilized. But due to the influence of the follicle stimulating hormone, these will turn into what we call the mature Glefian follicle. And it is only the mature Glefian follicle which is going to be needed. And then there is going to be a lot of these, thousands of these mature Glefian follicles inside the ovaries. But what is going to happen is that only the dominant Glefian follicle is the only follicle that is going to be fertilized by the sperm coming in from the male. So what happens is only the dominant follicle is the one which is going to be producing a large amount of estrogen, because these Glefian cells, these are the Glefian follicles, have the cells called the granulosa cells. And it is the granulosa cells which are going to be producing a large amount of estrogen. So the only dominant follicle is the one which is going to produce a large amount of estrogen, and that we match as the most dominant follicle. So what happens is that when estrogen is in the blood, high amount of estrogen lies when estrogen increases, then estrogen will be secreted in the bloodstream. And once the estrogen reaches the anterior pituitary gland, then it will tell the anterior pituitary gland to inhibit the production of the follicle stimulating hormone. It is only the high amount of estrogen which is going to inhibit the production of the follicle stimulating hormone by the anterior pituitary gland. Without the influence of estrogen, the anterior pituitary gland will still go on to be producing a large amount of follicle stimulating hormone. And when the amount of this hormone increases and the inhibition of the follicle stimulating hormone is done, then there's going to be another hormone which is going to be rising in secretions. And this hormone is what we call the luteinizing hormone, the LH, by the anterior pituitary gland, and this marks the end of the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. Once this hormone has started being produced, then that means that the follicular phase has come to an end. It has only helped these the immature follicles to develop, to mature into what we call the Glefian follicles. This is the mature follicle. We need an ovary for fertilization to take place, and hence without the follicular stimulating hormone, these follicles in the female bodies can't develop into secondary cells, can't develop into secondary follicles, can't develop into Glefian follicles. Hence, fertilization will not take place. So this marks the end of the follicular phase, and we also move on to what we call the ovulation phase. So the first, menstruation phase, the second, the follicular phase, and the third is the ovulation phase. So what happens in the ovulation phase? Again, it is important for us to draw a diagram so that we see what is happening. Because ovulation really is the release of an ovum from the inside, from inside of the mature Grecian follicle and into the ovaries in order to be transported via the fallopian tubes towards where it can be fertilized. So this is what ovulation really is. So what we do is we are going to draw a diagram of the Grecian follicles, the Grecian mature follicle, which is secreting an ovum, the oocyte, from its inside towards outside, and that is towards the areas of the lumen of the ovaries, because we want this egg to go on and be fertilized somewhere where it can be fertilized. So this is an ovum, of course, with the cell inside, and fertilized, ovulated. That is the process of ovulation. So this is an ovum, and this is the mature Grecian follicle. It has been matured from the secondary follicles, probably from the follicles of babies, which were not able to function as a result of large amount of follicles, the follicle stimulating hormone. So these are still the Grecian follicles. And then the cells of these acquire what we call the granulosa cells. Due to the influence of the luteinizing hormone, the LH, this has ovulated. So this is what ovulation is all about. But as well as that, what the luteinizing hormone will do will change the nature of this after it has ovulated. So this is ovulation, of course, but after ovulation, the luteinizing hormone will change the nature of this into what we call the corpus luteum. This will, after the ovary has been ovulated, the oocyte, then the nature of this cell, the follicle, the Grecian follicle, will change into what we call the corpus luteum. And immediately after this, then the luteal phase starts. But first, before we go to the luteal phase, I want to make a clear point that it is only during ovulation that the woman can become pregnant. Anywhere else, the woman can get pregnant in any stages, but during the ovulatory phase, that's the only phase in which the woman can become pregnant after having intercourse and protected intercourse. And having said so, it is said that the ovulation phase happens at around about day 14. But because the sperm can live inside the ovum, inside the female genitalia, for up to 5 days, so it means that having sexual intercourse in as early as 5 days prior to ovulation phase, then the sperm can live up to there and wait up until the ovulation period comes in. So for example, if somebody had a sex or intercourse or at around about day 9, then they can become pregnant, because the sperm can only live up to 5 days. They'll still be active, and then they will live up to meet up to that day when it comes. So it is very important to note that as midwives, so that we can prevent unwanted pregnancies. We move on now to the luteal phase, and as well as that, what happens in the ovulatory phase is that these cells, they will start producing a large amount of progesterone. So let's see what happens in the luteal phase. So we are not going to remove this diagram. We are going to use it to explain the luteal phase. But this is the ovulatory phase. So this is the fourth one. And during this phase, the estrogen, the luteinizing hormone will change the nature of this into what we call the corpus luteum. After the ovum has been released, all this nature will change its name from the corpus luteum to, it will change its nature from this Grecian mature follicle to corpus luteum. So after the ovum has been released, this becomes the corpus luteum. In these cells, the glandular cells changes their name again due to the influence of this hormone. They will change their cells names to what we call the luteal cells. And it's these cells that are going to be producing a large amount of progesterone, because progesterone will maintain the endometrium. And then as well as that, they also produce a small amount of estrogen, at least to make the tissues of the endometrium soft, and the tissues of the uterus, the cervix, and everything to be at least soft. So estrogen is defined as is termed as the developing hormone, and progesterone is the maintaining hormone. After estrogen has developed the endometrium, the progesterone is going to maintain it. And as well as that, these cells also produce the relaxing hormone. This hormone is going to relax the muscles or the uterus or the endometrium. It's going to make them at least relax, so that we don't have these muscular activities vigorously of the uterus, so that we can eject the embryo, which can be implanted during that period, because of course we are preparing it for pregnancy. And if there is no relaxing hormone, then the muscular activity of the uterus can eject the baby. So it is very important. So these are going to be producing a large amount of progesterone. But what happens is that if the egg does not get fertilized, then the corpus luteum will change its nature into a non-functional structure called the corpus albicans. And the corpus albicans is non-functional. So what happens is that the corpus albicans will no longer produce progesterone. And that simply means the endometrium, the pregnancy will not be maintained. Again, since this is non-functional, and that simply means it will not produce the estrogen. Then the tissues, all the uterus, all the endometrium, all the female reproductive genitalia cannot be produced or developed. So we are going to have this thing, the corpus albicans, which is non-structural, the non-structural functional. And then the other thing is that there will be no production of relaxing hormone, of course. Then the muscular activity of the uterus will increase. So the relaxing hormone will not be there, then the muscular activity of the uterus will be increased. And as a result, what happens is that the unfertilized ovum, if it's not released, if it's not fertilized, then the unfertilized ovum, the oocyte, will be ejected, and that marks the onset of the next menstrual period. But if there is fertilization, then there is another hormone which is going to be produced by the chorion of the embryo, and that hormone is called the HCG. This is the human chorionic gonadotrophic hormone, and this one is only going to be produced during the first 8 days of conception. And that's simply important because we are going to detect pregnancy in its earliest stages, looking for this hormone in the blood or urine. So the pregnancy means it's going to be supported by this type of hormones. That's what happens, and that marks, if it's not fertilized, then that simply means we are going to have the onset of the next menstrual period. That's basically what is going on during this process of menstruation. It is important for us to understand this so that we can minimize unwanted conception.